to harm. And I think that's never okay. Whereas sometimes in our way we use the word anger, sometimes that's not there. For example, you know, if a young child is running across the road without looking and the mother sees that, then often the mother won't go, "Oh, Johnny, please don't do that." Because he's probably not going to pay any attention. I mean, she'd probably use very strong language, very loud, to get across to the child the danger of doing that. And then we go, "Oh, she's really angry." But from a Buddhist perspective, unless she wants to hurt the child, that's not anger. That's compassion. That's what's called strong, forceful compassion. So it's really what's driving our behaviour, whether it's anger or compassion. Why is it actually that we get angry at people who behave badly, particularly the ones who are trying to harm us? And then at the same time, why is it so difficult to have forgiveness and compassion for these people? And I think there's a very simple answer. So if someone's behaving badly, the correct perspective is simply acknowledging, seeing, there's a person doing a bad or harmful behaviour. But very often in this situation, we often tend to adopt a different perspective. Often our perspective is, there's a bad person, horrible person, nasty person. And so what we've done here is we have fused the behaviour to the person. We've fused them together and made them one thing. In psychology, this is called cognitive fusion. And of course, this is a false, invalid perspective, because there are two things here. There is the person and their behaviour. They're not one thing. And if we do this cognitive fusion, we're in trouble. Because in any given situation, we've got two choices: accept or reject. And generally, if someone's behaving badly, we reject. But that rejection, on the basis of cognitive fusion, ends up in attacking the person, because we've fused the behaviour to the person. We get angry with them, we attack them. Because actually the thing we don't like is their behaviour. But because we've stuck the behaviour to the person, we direct that rejection to the person themselves. And we attack and get angry at the person. And if we understand that this is not helpful, the only other option left is accept. But if we accept on the basis of cognitive fusion, we end up accepting their bad behaviour. And of course, this is also not helpful. But they're the two choices we've got if we do cognitive fusion. And then, of course, when it comes to forgiveness and compassion, it becomes almost impossible. Because forgiveness and compassion for a bad person feels like what we're saying is, oh, what you did is okay, I don't mind. Of course we should mind. And it gets even worse than that. Because if we do this cognitive fusion, we end up with a fixed, biased view of that person. And then it becomes very difficult to acknowledge any good things they do. Because bad people don't do good things. which means if this person does something good, we tend to brush it off and go, well, they didn't really mean it because they're just such a bad person. And of course, the simple solution to all of this is don't do cognitive fusion, because cognitive fusion is a false, invalid perspective. Simply adopt the correct perspective and acknowledge there is a person doing a harmful behaviour. Then we can accept the person, i.e. forgiveness or compassion, and at the same time reject their negative behaviour, not tolerate that negative behaviour, and help that person to address their negative behaviour. And then we can, of course, have a balanced view of that person. Now, we also do this with ourselves. If we've done something harmful, rather than simply acknowledging I've done that harmful behaviour, we often do this, I'm just a bad person. And then we attack ourselves. We end up with a fixed, biased view of ourselves. I'm just a horrible person. I don't deserve forgiveness or compassion. We end up with low self-esteem and self-hatred. And this is also where guilt comes from. If we've done something harmful and we feel guilty, what are we focusing on? Bad me. So guilt comes from cognitive fusion. So we don't need to feel guilty about anything. All that guilt does is it paralyses and makes us feel bad. It doesn't even address the negative behaviour, and it's coming from a false, invalid perspective. Rather, instead of guilt, regret. If we've done something harmful and we regret, what are we focusing on? Our bad behaviour. So regret comes from a correct perspective. We can still feel good about ourselves and not tolerate our negative behaviour, regret that and look at ways of overcoming it. And I think this is one of the main reasons we have this epidemic of low self-esteem in our modern society, is that not only are we tend to only focus on the negative in the modern society, we just look in the media, everything is negative. So we end up with a biased view, and then usually when we look at all that negative stuff for others and ourselves, we do this, and of course then what follows is low self-esteem and even self-hatred. And on that point, I mentioned, I think earlier, is that in some of the modern day mindfulness traditions, they define mindfulness as something like a non-judgmental awareness of whatever is arising in the present moment. Good. But then when people hear, I have to be non-judgmental, then often the result is a complete disaster. Because we're doing this normally. And so for us, non-judgmental based on this means don't do this, which means do this. And in fact, that's sometimes how it's presented in modern traditions. Accept everything. Ethical disaster. Absolute ethical disaster. So non-judgmental really means don't do this. Do this. Which means instead of judging, we must evaluate. We must evaluate our own and others' behaviour. Because judging leads to blaming, leads to attacking ourselves and others. It's not helpful. Whereas evaluating our own and others' behaviour leads to compassion and looking at addressing that negative behaviour, overcoming that negative behaviour. And of course also if we do cognitive fusion, that causes division. Because if someone's behaving badly and we see them as a bad person, well, they're one of the bad people, but I'm one of the good guys. I'm a good person. They're bad people. We need to get rid of those bad people. And so we attack them. And that's not helpful. Whereas if we do this, cognitive fusion causes division. This, the correct perspective, causes cooperation. Because we're all people trying to be happy. And we all sometimes do harmful things. And so rather than judging, blaming, condemning, attacking, we evaluate. We have forgiveness and compassion. We don't tolerate that negative behaviour, whether it's ours or someone else, and we work to improving that, overcoming that. Unfortunately, this cognitive fusion, I think, is epidemic in our modern world. And it's unfortunately sort of locked into our language and the way of speaking. You know, how often do we see when a young child is misbehaving, the parent goes, bad girl, bad boy. I mean, it's an absolute disaster, absolute disaster. And because we have so much focus on the negative in our modern society, unfortunately some therapies, as a way of overcoming that, just go to the other extreme. And so as a way of overcoming that I'm a bad person, some therapies say, no, you're a good person. In fact, you're a special person. Disaster. Absolute disaster. Because if we believe it, oh yes, I am special. In fact, I'm better than everyone else. So it leads to arrogance and being very dismissive of others. Big ego trip. And of course, usually, eventually, we see that we're not actually that special, and that will confirm to us, actually, we're just hopeless, we're bad. So the answer is to stop doing cognitive fusion. The answer is, if we do this, we can have good self-esteem, feel good about ourselves, and at the same time not tolerate any negative behaviour, our own or others' negative behaviour. Any questions? Yeah.
Where does shame fit into this?
Shame. It depends a little bit how the word shame is defined. I think even in some Buddhist systems it's defined a little bit differently. So when you use the word shame, what do you mean?
I'm speaking of it like in the Brene Brown context. In the Brene Brown context, when she defines shame as it's kind of in the realm of guilt, but it's
yeah, then it's not helpful.
It's different. It's not thinking you're necessarily a bad person. It's sort of being overcome with a sense of.
Well, if it leads to us feeling bad about ourselves, that's not helpful. That's probably based on this. Whereas shame, as in terms of regret, is helpful. So if shame, what do you mean by shame? If it means like, oh, I'm bad, that's not helpful. Of course it's not. I mean, we're just beating ourselves up. If shame means simply acknowledging and regretting negative behaviour, that's good.
I think it's more in the
yeah.
I think it's more in the cognitive fusion sense, like cultural shame, things like that.
Yeah. That's not helpful. I mean, that's this. I mean, that's not useful at all. And unfortunately, because we are locked really into this a lot, I mean, basically these are our two options. I mean, that's it. And both of them are not helpful. So rather we just stop doing this because it's a false, invalid perspective. That technically we can say there is no such thing as a bad person. There are only people who sometimes do bad things. If we have that way of thinking, I think everything will take care of itself.
Okay. Thank you.
About the connection between empathy and compassion.
Mm-hmm. Good question. The connection between empathy and compassion. We need empathy to have compassion, because empathy is a resonation, a connection with others' suffering, that we can see their suffering. If we have no empathy, you can have no compassion. Because without empathy, then it's not even, we don't care about it. So empathy, which is an emotion, is what leads to compassion. Sometimes we hear about compassion burnout. Technically, there's no such thing. You can't burn out from having a wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering. That's impossible. Really, what they're saying when they say compassion burnout, it's empathy burnout. And that comes because we're connecting with others' suffering, but we see there's no hope of fixing that. So empathy plus no hope equals burnout. Empathy plus hope, based on understanding what is the underlying cause of suffering, and actually we can eliminate the underlying cause of suffering, empathy plus hope leads to compassion. So that's why we need to understand what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, and the fact that we can eliminate it. If we don't understand those three things, and we're very empathic, we'll get burnt out. And that's empathy burnout. If we understand these three things, that empathy will translate into very strong compassion. And it's impossible to get burnt out with that. So that's the relationship, is empathy is what leads to compassion. But for that to lead to compassion, we have to understand suffering, the cause of suffering, and how to eliminate that. Otherwise, burnout.
But what if I understand all those three things, and yet I know that the person that I feel empathy for, he won't want to understand those things. So for him, there is no hope.
In the short term, maybe yes. In the long term, there's always hope. So of course, if we have a very short-term perspective that we need to eliminate that suffering now, then of course this is completely unrealistic. Because, again, we can't make people change. All we can do is help them to be a positive influence and maybe give them some advice. That's all we can do. And we can't do more than that. If we have the expectation we can wave a magic wand and dispel their suffering, then of course we're going to end up in despair. So that's the burnout again. So, and often if we're trying to help others with this, and they're very closed-minded, then what we don't want to do is say, I know the answer, you need to do this. Because you've effectively shut the door on any chance you had of helping them. Because we know from our own experience, if someone tries to force something onto us, even if it's the best thing for us, we usually reject it. So we don't want to force anything onto anyone. So we have to use what's called skillful means. We have to sort of evaluate where the person is at and try to help them. And if they're very close-minded, often one of the only ways to help them is to lead by example and improve yourself. And then they may say, wow, you're becoming more kind, compassionate and so forth, seem to have less suffering. What are you doing? Then they may ask. So this is what we have to do.
So maybe it's because I'm thinking, of course, from a personal perspective about empathy burnout, and then I think maybe it's some kind of aversion towards the suffering of others.
Yeah. Again, for us, that empathy, again, it's only aversion that can cause suffering. So with that empathy is really what comes for us is this. Yeah. I don't like to see that. And we get overwhelmed. And so the empathy leads to burnout because of this aversion. If we had no aversion, then we wouldn't suffer. But it's our aversion to suffering that makes us suffer.
And how can we treat that?
So nice.
Well, we're going to look at that in some detail, but certainly the first thing is to notice that and just watch that aversion. Because if we can watch the aversion, it can't go anywhere. Because then we're not focusing on the thing that's causing the aversion. And we can just watch that aversion, like watching anger, attachment, like watching any of them arise and pass. And the more we can do that, the more we're free of it. The less it can take hold of our mind. and the more we can be with it. And then eventually, of course, to eliminate aversion completely, we need to get rid of our distorted view of reality. So the long-term strategy for aversion, for anger, jealousy, attachment, all of those, is we need to cut the root, and the root is this distorted view of reality. So the Vipassana practice of emptiness, that's the long-term strategy. But in the short term, what can we do right now? The first step, as I mentioned with attachment, also here, is first cultivate mindfulness through the Shamatha practice. Because without mindfulness, what will happen, this will come. Before we know it's there, we're already overwhelmed. And then about the only thing we can do then is get out of that situation, run away. But the key, of course, here is to be able to catch attachment, aversion, whatever, as it's arising. And we can only do that if we have more mindfulness. If we have mindfulness, we can notice that aversion coming up and we just watch it. And if we watch it, we're actually free of it. And it can't go anywhere, it'll just go. So that's what we can do now. And then we take a break after this question.
The aversion, I'm happy with aversion until it's applied to somebody who's suffering and trying to not have aversion to other people's suffering.
Hang on, you're happy with what do you mean? You're happy to get rid?
I'm happy to work with aversion. I understand it's one of the 3 poisons.
Right.
When you talk about having aversion to someone else's suffering and having to work on that kind of aversion,
right,
that makes me feel a little bit like what else would trigger wanting to end other people's suffering unless you have that aversion.
Right. Yeah. Good question. And of course, here, and often people mistakenly think that if I don't have the aversion, I don't care. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, without aversion, we can be 100% caring. We can be 100% motivated because we resonate with their suffering because we've experienced something similar. That's where compassion comes from that empathy. And what you'll find is that the aversion will interfere with that. And we know from our own experience, when we have very strong aversion, it completely overwhelms us, doesn't it? It paralyzes us. How effective are we in helping others when we're overwhelmed? Not at all. In fact, we just sort of run away. And unfortunately, what often happens here is when we're faced with too much of this, at some point people go, this compassion doesn't work. I'm just suffering. And then they think, compassion is causing me suffering. I give up. That's tragic. Compassion always works. What's not working here is a lack of wisdom. So rather than give up compassion, we need to add wisdom into this. And then we can really be present and help without the aversion. But of course, that's going to take time. That's going to take time. But the more we can do that, the more you'll find that letting go of dropping the aversion doesn't mean somehow we're disconnecting and we're sort of... sometimes people, when we talk about this equanimity, sometimes people mistakenly think that Buddhism is about this sort of like blank mind in the face of suffering. This is pathological. This has nothing to do with equanimity. What we're talking about is being fully present and not reacting but responding. And if we're reacting with aversion, we're not going to be able to be very helpful for that person. So if we can drop that, we can be fully present and engaged and help in whatever way we can. Okay, let's take a tea break. Again, 3:45, next door, the yoga session, of course, and then we'll come back at 5 o'clock and we'll continue this Shamatha practice. In fact, I didn't get to talk about how to deal with anger, so we'll begin the next session on how to deal with anger, and then we'll go back into the Shamatha practice at the nostrils. Let's take a break now.